Conditional statements such as if, else, and switch are extremely useful for making decisions and are at the core of why computing is so valuable. However, these statements only execute once, and then they are done. Sometimes we need to perform an action over and over again until something happens. For example, if we are baking and a recipe calls for 4 cups of flour, then we need to scoop a cup of flour into the bowl until the bowl contains 4 cups of flour. When writing a recipe, we wouldn't write the line, scoop a cup of flour into the bowl 4 times. That would be ridiculous and unnecessary. We would write something like, scoop 4 cups of flour into the bowl. Programming is the same. We don't want to repeat ourselves. When we need to repeat any action, we can use something called a loop. Loops allow us to repeat some code until a condition is met. Like our baking example, we would scoop flour into the bowl until the total amount of flour in the bowl was equal to 4 cups. There are different types of loops in JavaScript, and they can each be used for similar things. But it's better to know the strengths of each so that we can use them when they are the right tool for the job. The first type of loop is a for loop. A for loop is good when you know how many times you need to iterate. That means how many times you need it to loop through your code. For example, if you have a specific number of iterations you want to perform, or if you have an array or collection you want to iterate over, so you know what to perform, a number of iterations equal to the number of elements in the collection. There are 3 pieces that go into the start of a for loop, and then there's the body of the code that will execute in your for loop. Let's take a look at these pieces. So to start a for loop, we use the for keyword. And then we follow that by some parentheses. Inside these parentheses, there are 3 pieces. We have a variable initialization, the condition that has to be met, and then what's going to happen after the iteration, the post iteration, or where we most of the time increment the variable that's initialized. So the first part is the variable initialization. So I can go ahead and say let I equals 0. And then we put a semicolon. We're going to divide these 3 sections by a semicolon. The next part is the condition. Let's go ahead and say as long as I is less than 10, that's our condition. It's a Boolean expression, which means this loop will iterate until this condition is no longer true. If I starts out at 0, 0 is less than 10, so this is true. We will perform an iteration of the loop. And at the end of each loop, we're going to go ahead and increment I++. So eventually, I will no longer be less than 10. Then we follow by a set of curly braces. Everything inside this curly brace, this opening and closing curly brace, is the body of the for loop. And that is the code that will execute for each iteration of the loop. So for this one, let's just go ahead and do a console log, and we'll log out I. Save this and take a look at it. Open this in our default browser. And open our console. And we can see it printed out 0 through 9. So let's take a look at how that works. If we go back to our code, I starts at 0. So this is a regular variable. As long as I is less than 10, we're going to perform an iteration. Now this part, this gets skipped. This runs, then this runs, and then the body of our loop runs, all the code in here. So we print out 0 because that's what I equals first. And then we jump up to here and we run the post iteration, which is where we're going to increment I. And then this runs, and then the body runs, and then that runs. Then this, then the body, then this. So I equals 1 now. Is 1 less than 10? Yes, it is. We're going to go ahead and print out 1, come up here and increment it. Is 2 less than 10? Yes, it is. So this is still true. This Boolean expression still evaluates to true, so we iterate again. And we do that until I equals 9. Is 9 less than 10? Yes, it is. Let's go ahead and print out I. Increment, I is now equal to 10. Is 10 less than 10? No, 10 is equal to 10, but it's not less than 10. Therefore, this evaluates to false, and no more iterations are performed, and the code will move on to whatever's next. If we save that, come back here and refresh, we can see we go from 0 to 9, and then we move on to whatever's after that loop. So let's take a look at another example here. Let's print some even numbers. So we'll go ahead and say for let I equals 0, while I is less than, let's just do 20, I plus plus. Now I can use I again here because this I, this variable, only exists within the scope of this loop. So after this loop ends, this I no longer exists. So I can reuse it here. And I is a common variable for your for loops, standing for index, short for index. It goes against our normal naming conventions where we try to be very specific about what our names are, but this is a generally accepted variable name. It's an industry standard in your loops. So we can go ahead and say for, and inside of our for loops, we can put any other type of code, a call to a function, we can put if statements, other conditionals, and so that's what we're going to do here. To print out only our even numbers, we're going to put an if statement here. So we're going to say if I mod 2 is equal to 0, meaning that it is even, then we're going to log out I. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything. So we come in here, refresh that, and we can see we're getting all the even numbers from 0 to, well, we stop before 20, so we don't get 20, because I is less than 20. If we change that to less than or equal, we can refresh, and there we see 20. So that's the for loop. We use for loops when we know how many times we want to iterate, or if there is an array that we want to iterate over each element in it. For example, do that real quick. Let names equal so if I want to iterate over each one of these names, I can say for let I equal 0, while I is less than names.length I plus plus. So I, if the length here is 3, I is going to go until it's 3 and then it's to exit out, which means 2 will be the last one, the last iteration. And since arrays are 0-based indexing, this is 0, 1, 2. So we can now use I to reference every element in that array, just like we normally reference elements in arrays. So I can go ahead and say console.log, my array name, and then we use our square brackets. And instead of putting a number in there, we're going to put the variable I, which will be 0, then 1, then 2, which means it will print out everything. So if we look at this, we can see all of our 3 names got printed out. So that can be very useful anytime we want to do something to every element in an array or another object. So let's take a look at our while loops. A while loop is like a for loop, but it has a lot less setup. It gives you a little more flexibility over what you're going to do. And it's good for when you need to do something over and over until a condition is met, but you have less knowledge of how many iterations are needed. So a good example could be reading lines from a file. Your program may not know how many lines are in the file because it's external to the program, but with a while loop, you can read each line until you find the end of a file. Or while another line exists, your program will read it. The only piece that goes into parentheses of a while loop is the condition. So unlike a for loop that has 3 pieces, we only have the condition. So we start with the while keyword, and then we put our condition. So let's do something here. We'll say let a equal 0. So we've got some variable right here. We're going to go ahead and say while a is less than 10. And you can see how it's very similar to, it can be similar to a for loop. We can do the exact same thing as a for loop with it. We'll say console.log a. So if we run this, we can see a whole bunch of zeros being printed out there. And it's going on and on forever. I'm going to stop this. So what happened is we said a is equal to 0. As long as a is less than 10, go ahead and log out a. We never did anything else to a. A never changes. Therefore, a is always 0. So what we've created here is an infinite loop, which is something we need to be a little more careful about with our while loops, because if the variable in the condition that we're looking at is never changing, then this condition will never change. So it can just loop infinitely and it can cause things to crash. So we'll go ahead and close our browser. There's a good example of it crashing, so I'm going to open my task manager. All right, one more try. There we go. So I was able to end the task for our browser. So be careful not to have an infinite loop. So what we can do here is I could add an a++. And now you can see that it's very similar to a for loop, because we set our variable, we set our condition, and we set what we want to happen outside of it. We just have more flexibility in how we set that. So if I save this, come back here and open this back up in the browser, open our console. There's our 0 through 9 printed out from our while loop. The last loop we're going to talk about is a do while loop. A do while loop is like a while loop, but it will always iterate at least once. And we check the condition at the end. So in our while loop, we check this condition first. If this was false from the get-go, so let's say this equaled 100, 110, this would be false. So this would never iterate. A do while loop will iterate at least once. So we could go ahead and say do, followed by some curly braces. Let's say console.log a while a is less than 10. So take a look at this. Refresh this. So a never got ran from the while loop, right? Because right after we printed out the names, we never got that. A never printed out here because a is not less than 10. But we do have a printed out once right here because this ran and then it checked and said, is a less than 10? No, 110 is not less than 10, so it never ran again. So anytime you have something that has to happen at least once and then continue to happen, a do while loop is a good example. Now, in addition to these three main loops, the for, the while, and the do while, there are two additional types of for loops that we can use. These are modified versions of a for loop. So we can use the for in loop or the for of loop, which will each perform an iteration for each element or item in an array. And we're going to talk about arrays a little later, but for now just think of an array as a list of values. Just like this right here, this is an array and it's a list of values. We've got 3 different strings in here. So let's look at the for in loop. So if I say for, we'll use this names up here again. I can say for I in names, and this is a short version of writing our traditional for loop. What it's going to do is I is going to start at 0, and it's going to increment for us without us having to write any of the incrementation code. So I could just go ahead and say console.log names I, and use I just like that. So if we save this, refresh, we get the names printed out again. A for of loop is going to, instead of looping through the index, which is what I is, it's actually going to loop through the object itself, so the value itself. So if I did I here, I of, the difference is of instead of in, for I of names, console.log, I could just go ahead and log out I. And that's going to, I itself is the name. We can see those here. And just to show that example, I'm going to change this. Instead of names.I, I'm just going to log out I. So let's log out I here. And we'll see 012 Sam, Tom, Hillary. So normally I wouldn't use I here. I would give it a different name. And in this case, since my array is names, I would say for each name of my names array. And that's just a better naming convention. Let's see. Let's clear that out. Oh, and I have I right here. I need to fix that name, right? The variable has to match. So for each name of names, I'm going to log out the name, refresh this, and there's our names. So again, loops are very useful for when we want to repeat code over and over again, or do something to each element in an array or some kind of list.